Oh, come on. Hi, everybody. My name is Sarah Colley. I am the Community Engagement Coordinator here at the Great Falls Public Library. And I love being here and being able to bring programming to Great Falls on a continuous and pretty regular basis. It's always such a pleasure to have all of you here in this room, whether you're new down here or you've been here many times over, especially in the last, month and a half. I just thank you for being here tonight. Today we have Chris Latreille joining us to talk about his book, Becoming Little Shell. Chris Latreille is a Métis storyteller, a descendant of the Pembina Band of the mighty Red River of the North, and a citizen of the Little Shell tribe of Chippewa Indians. His third book, Becoming Little Shell, A Landless Indian's Journey Home, was published by Milkweed Editions on August 20th, 2024, and has received a number of accolades, including Pacific Northwest Book Award, and Writing the West Award, and Best Memoir of the Year selections from both People and Esquire magazines. Today we are celebrating that he has also been selected as One Book Montana as a part of Humanities Montana. That program is statewide, so thank you to Humanities Montana for making that a possibility. And they also chose the Great Falls Public Library to be the host of One Book Montana this year. So all book club kits are coming through our facility and going out to all of the other libraries in the state through our courier system. It's a great partnership that we have, and we are excited to work with Humanities Montana now and in the future. So support them with funding, please. We are excited to have Chris Latreille join us today to talk about his book. Like I said, we also have Cassiopeia Books over here selling not only Becoming Little Shell, but his two other books as well. So please feel free to participate in a sale with Cassiopeia. And I don't want to take up any more time because you're not here to listen to me. So please join me in welcoming Chris Latreille.
Bonjour. Bonsoir, Ninoy Mahanadug. Chris Latreille, Nijinakaz, Chris Kasha, Nikishin. Hello and good evening, all of my relatives. My name is Chris Latreille, but you can call me Chris. And I feel like my usual spiel is kind of unnecessary in this room since just about everybody knows who the Métis are. But for those who don't, as a citizen of the Little Shell, we are Anishinaabe. So we speak in Anishinaabe-Moan or Anishinaabe, or Ojibwe-Moan or Ojibwe or Chippewa, which are all different words for the same thing, which is who we are as a culture and what our language is. So Buju is hello, Indinue Maganadug is all of my relatives, and Chris Latreille, Nijinakaz, is my name is Chris Latreille. So any one of you could leave this room and say my name is, or just say Elisa Herodes, Nijinakaz, and you're speaking our language. Of course, Elisa already knows that. But I also spoke to you in Michif, so Bonsoir is good evening. Chris Kasha, Nikishin is, you can call me Chris, which is probably the most important thing I've said so far, because people get caught up on calling me Mr. Latreille or all that stuff, and I hate that. So if we ever run into each other, you can call me Chris Kasha, Nikishin. Michif is the language of the Métis people, and who the Métis people are is an Indigenous cultural group recognized in Canada as one of the 3 Indigenous peoples who predate the existence of Canada as a country. So it's the Métis, the First Nations, and the Inuit. We just so happen to predate the existence of the United States as well, but the United States chooses not to recognize us as an Indigenous cultural group at all, which leads me to say what I always say: we didn't cross the border crossed us. So we predate, my tribal ID says I'm Chippewa Cree, which is kind of code for Métis, more often than not. And the Little Shell, we are largely comprised of Métis people. And that is an identity that I feel is growing and growing as more people become aware of really where we came from and who we are and what our legacy is in this particular part of the world, and it is a mighty one. It was funny, I did an event at a bookstore in Longmont, Colorado here 3 weeks or so ago. Longmont's kind of like Boulder, and there was a woman there who is from Turtle Mountain. She's a citizen of the Turtle Mountain Chippewa, which we are so closely related to that most of us Little Shell people could enroll today, or disenroll from the Little Shell today and enroll Turtle Mountain tomorrow. We are that closely related. And I don't know, there were 40 or 50 people at this little bookstore event, and you know, she came up to me afterwards as everybody had left, and she said, you know, what troubles me is that, you know, those 40 or 50 people who just heard your presentation now know more about our people than most of our own people know, which is one of those tragedies of dedicated erasure, which is largely what our people have undergone for centuries, at least beyond our own kitchen tables. And kind of my goal for becoming Little Shell was to write something to help people like me who, when I started my efforts to reconnect to my ancestry, I didn't know anything either. And I came to learn a lot through all of the people that I got to speak to as I moved through our communities, gathering the information that became becoming Little Shell. And my hope is that 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, we will be much more knowledgeable about where we come from, much more proficient in sharing our language with the world, much more involved in our community as far as returning to our ceremonial practices and all of those things. And there are so many more people now, I feel like, who are engaged in that effort than it was, you know, when we first met, you know, however many years ago that's been. I just really feel this upswell of interest and dedication, and I'm really grateful to be kind of involved in that and see it happening. So first I want to ask, how many of you have already read the book? Because I'm trying to decide what I really want to do tonight. I could read, what I usually do when I do a book event is I read kind of a condensed version of the introduction, but you know, that's when you're trying to sell a bunch of books. And if everybody's already read it, you know, I don't know. But, you know, I thought maybe I could talk about just how a book like this comes to be. And what I really want to get to is a point where we're having some questions. So I'm hoping that some of you came with some things you wanted to learn as a result of our time together. And I'd like to get to those as quickly as possible, because what I find is that the real benefit of coming together like this in these types of gatherings is when we exchange our stories and we have questions and we answer each other and we leave the room feeling more like something we participated in rather than just some old dude blathering on and putting everybody to sleep, which I'm quite capable of delivering that kind of evening as well. But let's go back to September, August of 2018, when my first book, One Sentence Journal, came out. I was at a little writing workshop retreat thing in Greeno, Montana, which is kind of in the, like on the way on Highway 200. If you're headed towards the Clearwater interchange, you know, where the cow is, between you know, Missoula and there is Greeno, kind of back in the hills, back kind of where Paws Up is, where all the rich people go. And there's that little dude ranch back there, and that's where this festival was taking place, or this workshop every summer. And 2018, my first book comes out, and I go and I do a reading and that kind of stuff. Led a workshop, I think. And there was a woman there who was an editor from Milkweed Editions. And she had just done a discussion about how you get your book published, which I didn't attend. And later, we're sitting on a bench together, having a beer, just talking, and I said, you know, I have this idea for this book that I've been kicking around for a few years, and I give kind of the 50,000-foot elevator idea of what becoming Little Shell will ultimately become. And she said, yeah, I think we would be interested in hearing more about that book. And they were kind of in my headlights anyway, because they hit my radar because they were publishing the work of Richard Wagamese, who is an Ojibwe writer from Canada, who was very successful in Canada, but had never broken over into the United States. And they began publishing his work, which, if you are not familiar with Richard Wagamese, he's a freaking genius. And I just felt like if they recognized in him something of valuable to the American book audience, then they were on a track that I felt like I wanted to be part of. I even went so far as to, back in the day when publishers would put little print catalogs together, I put one on my little altar, I call it, where I burn my medicines every morning and stuff, just to manifest a relationship with milkweed. And so yeah, I pitch her that idea, not even formally, and I leave that workshop just kind of excited, like, well, maybe this could happen. And a couple months later, she leaves Milkweed and told me, I think you should still go ahead and pursue this. So I did. I wrote like 3 chapters and a rough kind of everything and the kitchen sink outline of what I thought the book should be. And the next year at the same retreat, Daniel Slager, who is the president and CEO of Milkweed, was there. And we'd kind of gotten to know each other because I was involved in the kind of book selling environment because I was working part-time as a bookseller at Fact and Fiction in Missoula. And I handed him my proposal. And every time I tell this story, it gets shorter in the amount of time from when he comes back. So in the reality, it was probably 3 hours. But I'm gonna tell you tonight, I handed it to him and he kind of flipped through it and said, yeah, we're gonna publish this book. Point being is he took that back to his cabin and read my proposal and then came back and told me, yeah, we're gonna publish this book. And a month later, I get the contract and in advance, and now I have to write the frickin' thing. Because that's the thing about nonfiction, is you don't have to write it first. Novels, you have to write and present the whole book. But in nonfiction, you just have to have an idea and show them that you have the facility with the word to actually be able to write something coherent. And I feel like Daniel and Milkweed kind of took a chance on me because they didn't know, who I was or what was going on. Next thing that happens is the Little Shell get our federal restoration in December of that same year. So my happy ending is ensured. I now know that the ending I wanted to write to is going to be a good one because we got what we were hoping for, right? Then what happens? COVID happens. And COVID sets the whole book industry back about 1.5 years, 2 years. And at least that's the excuse I use for taking so long to write the freaking thing. There's the story there too of how that affected the Little Shell as a tribe. We gathered on January 25th of 2020 for our big celebration, and then a month and a half later, COVID hits, and we didn't gather as a tribe again until our powwow in 2022, I think was the first one back. So that's a long time. And meanwhile, I'm trying to write this book, and I'm traveling around, and I'm talking to people like Al Weisman, and I went to Minnesota to participate in a commemoration of the Treaty of Old Crossing, and on my way back from that, I visited Turtle Mountain, where it all starts, in Belcourt, or Belcourt, as they say in other places. And all of that churning kind of results in the first draft of Becoming Little Shell, which was much more of just kind of more of a history book, I guess, narrative nonfiction. And I turned it in, and Daniel said, yeah, this is great, but we need more of you in it. And I was like, oh shit. Because that was what I was afraid of. I kind of knew he was going to say that. And that's when it kind of became more memoir. And that second draft, I have to tell you, was the hardest writing I've ever done. And I don't necessarily mean the actual act of typing the words out. It's all the time sitting and reflecting on the stories, particularly of my family. How much of the turmoil and dysfunction in my family do I want to share? And what is my responsibility as a storyteller versus my responsibility of not talking about things that maybe people who are still alive don't necessarily want talked about? And that is kind of the challenge of any writer who's writing about living history and living communities and living people. And there were times that I would finish a stretch of writing and I'd read back through it and I'd think, I'm a genius too. And I'd start imagining my leather and fur bespoke tuxedo to wear to the National Book Awards. And then the next day I'd reread the same passage and like, God, this is awful. Wendy's is paying $18 an hour. Maybe I'll give my tiny little advance back and just go back to being some schmuck living in Missoula. But I managed to get through that, turn that second draft in, and from that point, there was just a few polishing on the third draft, and that was it. And then all of a sudden, it's in process. And every step of the way, I'm pinching myself. Is this really happening? Is this really happening? And I remember having a conversation with Tommy Orange, who wrote the book There, and how he had a similar experience where he didn't really feel like it was real until he was sitting on a plane and he'd been given a copy of The Galley. What that is like a soft cover advanced reader copy. And he was supposed to read through it to make sure there weren't any last minute errors. And he said when he pulled that out on the plane and he had it in his hands, that was the first time he realized, wow, this is really happening. Tommy has since gone on to publish another book, and he just got a Genius Grant, a MacArthur Genius Grant. So, maybe there's hope for me yet. but there's all of these steps of the struggle of producing something like this. And I remember when the first review came out a few months, because a book gets turned in, and they want like 10 months to a year of pre-publication, publicity going. So those galleys go out to book reviewers and magazines and things like that, and interviews get set up so that when the book comes out, there's supposed to be this big splash. So the first review that came out, 3 months before the book was even coming out, and that was kind of freaked me out, because the guy is talking about my father's alcoholism and that relationship and all that, and that was my first real jolt of, that's the last thing my dad ever would have wanted out. And so I had one of those dark nights of the soul about the book all over again. Is it, what's my responsibility to protecting his life story, but at the same time, that reflected hugely on my life as well. And what does that say about why he denied being Native in the first place, which is kind of the seed of the whole story, is my father and my grandfather both denied that we were Native at all. And I wouldn't be here if my grandma hadn't been determined to make sure I knew where I came from. So my grandfather was kind of a tyrant. And if you look at any of the records, like census records or birth records or anything related to my grandmother, Ruby Catherine Doney Latreille, she shows up as either R for red, which is the term for Indian, or HB for half-breed. Every time she shows up until she gets with my grandfather. And from that point forward, every record that she's referenced in, census, marriage license, anything, she's listed as W for white. My grandfather, Leo Latreille, was determined to remake our family as white, but Grandma wasn't having it. She made sure that I knew and my sisters knew that we were Chippewa. So I identified as Chippewa my whole life, even though I didn't really know what that meant. And when Dad says one thing and Grandma says another, when you're a kid, well, who are you going to believe? You believe Grandma, because Grandma's the boss. So I carried that, and it wasn't until 1996 when my grandfather died, and I go to his funeral, and the church is full of Indians, and there's all these Latreilles, and my grandpa and my dad had both denied that we were related to any of the other Latreilles in Montana, which is just, we're all related. We all come from Mose and Susie, for the most part, who cranked out a pile of kids and grandkids and great-grandkids. And all over the state, I run into people and they say, are you related to Mose Latreille? And I'll say, yeah, that's my great-great-grandfather. And they say, well, mine too. So we were all related. And here are all these people that I'm supposedly not related to. And if that's the case, why are they here? And so that was kind of the first inkling of this story is not what I've been told. And, years pass, and, I start to hear about the Little Shell and this tribe of Chippewa who are trying to get federal recognition. Well, what does that mean? And maybe that answers the question as to why are there Chippewa in Montana when supposedly they're all in the Great Lakes? And then in 2013, I meet Nicholas Ruman. And in 20 minutes of time with Nicholas Ruman, I learn more about who I am and where we come from than I have for my entire life to that point. And I bought a copy of, The Whole Country Was One Robe that day, and I approached him after his presentation was over and told him who I was, and for the first time I say out loud to anybody that I'm thinking of writing a book about it. And Nicholas says, you have to. This is your story, and that's what he signs on the inside of that book. This is your story, I'm forgetting the exact words. But he signs it, and that book became the foundational text for me to write Becoming Little Shell. And him tell, hey, you need to talk to this person. You need to talk to that person. And so he kind of guided me through it. And from that point forward, I was writing this book. And it took 10 years of thinking about it and 4 years of actually writing it. And here we are. And I've been all over the country, up and down both coasts, Midwest, all around Montana. And I can guarantee there are more people who know about the Little Shell now than at any point in our history. And I'm grateful for the opportunities that Milkweed has given me to connect me to these places. I'm grateful that I bought a car that runs well and has gotten me from point A to point B safely a multitude of times. And I'm grateful for the fact that I was also appointed Poet Laureate in the middle of all this. Because those two opportunities crashing together, it wasn't so much 1 + 1 = 2, it was 1 + 1 = 2,000. It was exponential, the amount of requests for my time and my appearance and my, blathering in front of people, and the two served each other, and I'm grateful for all of that. And I feel like, that is something that our ancestors have a hand in saying, okay, we have this point in our history where we either need to seize it or it's going to drift away again, and I have felt like an instrument of that seizure, and I'm very grateful and fortunate to be in that position. So that's just a lot of literally off-the-cuff rambling, and I would love it if anybody has any questions. Let's begin the conversation. Yes?
So what was it specific? Well, I know you said your grandmother always identified as Chippewa. What was it in you that really made you want to learn more about your ancestors and your Native American heritage?
Well, at the simplest answer to that is I couldn't think of anything cooler than being an Indian. Because what I really wanted to be was Conan the Barbarian. And I couldn't be that, but I could be Chippewa, whatever that meant. And, I know it is hilarious, but it's true. That was the world I grew up in. And I bought into all of those narratives that were portrayed, usually by white guys dressed up as Indians, as to what an Indian was like. And, when I was younger, I just thought that was cool. When we played Cowboys and Indians, I was an Indian. And someone asked, well, could it make you be an Indian? I said, no. I wanted to chase all those little bastards around and make them afraid of this big, mean Indian, And so that was really the foundation for it, was the imagination, the false narrative, really, of what Indians have been depicted as. And, the more I learned, the more I realized that, Charlie Russell, this isn't speaking ill of him, but he went a long way towards, through his success, making the whole world think that every Indian looks like an extra from Dances with Wolves. And that's just not the case. We look like everybody, especially now when we have become intertribal of, marrying into each other's families and communities, which is what we did all along anyway. It's just been diluted even more by all of these other people from around the world that have come into communities that were traditionally ours. So that was the impetus, and that was my desire to be identified as that initially, was just the coolness of being an Indian. And then I learned that it was different, but also way much cooler than I ever anticipated it would be. The Métis are the preeminent buffalo culture of the Northern Plains. Nobody talks about it. When Ken Burns writes his documentary and scripts it, and Rosalind Lapierre tells him something different, he leaves that on the cutting room floor. But the Métis people, we were a mighty buffalo people, and no one could mess with us. And nobody talks about that. And I think that's pretty cool. Anybody else? Yes?
I had a
question that isn't just about becoming Little Shell, but because we've met before through sort of the poetry element, and I was wondering where you feel like your work predominantly lives in a library setting or a bookstore setting or something like that, because I know here in the library your books live in sort of social identity, but obviously some of your books are poetry, memoir, so they're spread out as far as perhaps where you would house them genre-wise. So do you feel like social identity for you is the appropriate umbrella for your work, or how do you see your work classified in an outward way?
Yeah, that's a great question, and that is something that we, like in the bookstore, we talk about all the time. You know, just breaking things out into genres. And in a perfect world, we wouldn't. The whole bookstore would be arranged alphabetically by author, whether it's fiction or nonfiction or not. And, you know, I would love that. My secret when One Sentence Journal came out and I was working in the bookstore is I had that sucker stashed in every section, so no matter where I was standing, if someone said, do you have a recommendation? Oh, as a matter of fact, I do. You know, in the cooking, this is kind of a cookbook. I just cooked up a bunch of bullshit and put it between a couple covers, but it's pretty good. But, you know, definitely my first two books are essentially poetry, and that's probably where they belong. Becoming Little Shell becomes problematic because, you know, some bookstores will put, and I don't know, you know, libraries are a different animal, but some bookstores will put like the native stuff, regardless of genre, all in one place. No, there's our native section. And I just feel like that's just another reservation for us because we deserve to be in every category. I won a High Plains Book Award that I really haven't talked about for Becoming Little Shell because it was the best book by a native writer, and I like to call it the Reservation Award. Because why do we need that category? Why can't we be viewed with everything else? But I would prefer if there's like a native nonfiction section for that book to be there and in the memoir section. You can be in two places, and all of my books are kind of hybrids, and that's something that is kind of a change in book publishing in general. There's a lot of hybrid type books, you know. Ross Gay is a renowned poet whose most famous book, The Book of Joy or Book of Delights, is this weird collection of essays, yet he's a poet. Where do you put it? So it's not just me who struggles with that, but you know, my first choice, if I was in charge, would be just not have separate, but you know, my poetry belongs in poetry, and Becoming Little Shell should be in the indigenous nonfiction as well as memoir. And that would, I could apply that to, you know, Louise Erdrich too, you know, she's written poetry and fiction. Joy Harjo has written nonfiction and poetry, and she's one of the best, you know, Joy and Louise, and James Welch, she's another one who has multiple books in multiple genres, so, you know, when we try and put things in boxes, that's when we start to struggle a little bit. The least important one to me is like about the discussion of identity, because I never struggled with my identity. I always knew I was Indian, and I never questioned that, thanks to grammar. What I didn't know is, what does that even mean? What does it mean to be Indian? What does it mean to be Anishinaabe? That's the thing I'm in right now. I've learned that I'm Little Shell, and I know where we come from. Well, now, what does it mean to live an Anishinaabe life? I learned this great word from this other Anishinaabe writer. She's Mississauga, which is one of the Anishinaabe peoples on the eastern side of the Great Lakes, and her name is Leanne Simpson. And she wrote this book called Dancing on the Turtle's Back, which is all about her time with an elder from her community. And she writes about this word called Jaganash Yadisi. And what that means, Jaganash is our word for white people. And Jaganash Yadisi is the practice of doing things that separate you from being Anishinaabe. It's like allowing all the decisions you make that colonize you even more and even more. And that, you know, for us to kind of rekindle where we come from, we need to consider our actions in the way we live our lives versus you know, the concept of Jaganashi Odyssey. Is this decision I'm making pushing me farther away from being an Anishinaabe, or is it bringing me closer to home? And that is how I'm trying to view my life now, is like today, I got a couple of emails. Carroll College wants me to talk about at some conference, and the honorarium that they're offering has to go through Montana State University. And Montana State University used to have this very tedious, bureaucratic process of registering to be a vendor and all of these things, which I did like a year ago. And now they've changed it and I have to do it all over again. And I got these emails with all the instructions and like, is this talk worth this? Am I being more Anishinaabe by just offering myself up to the whims of this institution that will also take 6 months to actually pay me? So I've made the decision that I'm just not going to do it. Saying no is one of the most important things that you can do sometimes when it comes to holding your ground for what you believe in. And I just don't want to participate in these kinds of institutions because it makes me less of what I feel like I should be. And that's I mean, I may change my mind if it is $1,000, but I probably won't. It's easier to walk away from $100 than it is $1,000. Yes.
What's it like to be the Montana Poet Laureate? What does that entail?
So, you know, in the past, I think, the question is what it's like to be Montana Poet Laureate. So, in the past, I think you were supposed to have some kind of a project. I wasn't instructed in anything like that because I was already on the road quite a bit talking about the Little Show. So I already had this kind of reputation as someone, you know, who will show up if you invite me. And so when I received my appointment, I sat down with the Arts Council people and the humanities people and said, okay, where's all the places in Montana that nobody ever goes? Because everybody goes to Bozeman and Missoula and Billings and Great Falls. Who goes to Ekalaka? You know, who goes to Circle? Who goes to Wolf Point? All of these little towns that deserve access to artists and speakers and all of the things that we grow accustomed to in the urban areas of Montana. And that was the best part, is not just the people there, who everywhere I've gone, with a couple individual exceptions, have been warm and just a joy to spend time with. That has been the best part. Not to mention the opportunity to drive all over Montana and see places that I've always been curious about, kind of off the beaten path, that are just mind-blowingly beautiful, you know, and how you can go through 3 of those in one long road trip. I drove out to Fargo here last month or 2 months ago, and I realized, you know, I live an hour in from the western border of Montana, and then I drove 8 hours and stopped for the night, and I was still in Montana. You know, so people are shocked at the vastness of the landscape around here, but that is also one of the things I love the most. And it's not like, you know, sometimes I get tired. Like, this is my 9th speaking gig in the last 4 days. So I left Monday with 10 in front of me that were going to end by the end of tonight. And that's probably more than I should have done. And again, I'm with a very vigorous band practice, so my voice was about shot before I opened my mouth once on the road. But 2 nights ago was one of the best events that I've done in my life. And that's because, well, it was in Harlem, and it was the little, you know, MAPS, the Media Arts for Public Schools group, has an office up there. And they had a room about this size if these posts were this wall. And there was, you know, 50 or 60 people crammed in there in long tables, and there was food, and everybody was serving food. And it was multi-generational. So we had kids all the way up to elders. And this is all Fort Belknap Native community people. And there are, you know, probably 75, if not 80% Native people there, which is a rarity for me to get to speak to audiences like that. And my friend Jamie Fox, who is a Métis fiddler, we've always talked about doing something, not just the same day, we've done that before, but doing something together. And so I put together some poems like right before the event, and we said, okay, here's your cue for these different things. And we interacted my poetry with her fiddle playing. And it was spectacular. It was transcendent, and everybody in that room was just moved, you know, there were tears. It was beyond, again, exponential, more than just this and this equals this. It was this and this equals this. And I can't wait to do that again. And now it's totally random, totally unplanned. And you get out on the road, and that's why I don't really plan things, because I want to react to what's going to happen. And that's what magic makes these events special sometimes. So that's been great. Yeah.
What are the things from your study that make the Métis culture and heritage distinct, maybe from a Pembina historical perspective, generally or specifically, or a Little Shell contemporary perspective?
Well, we have to remember that the Métis were, you know, it was the Pembina and Chippewa, but the Métis were part of that community. And Little Shell in particular made sure that the Métis folks had an equal voice in anything that was happening as far as the decision-making processes of the Pembina leadership. So our tribal government then was nothing like it is now. You know, now we've inherited this kind of colonial idea of top-down government, and our tribal council, for better or worse, can kind of decide within the meeting what they're going to do, and that's what we do. There's no real involvement of the whole community to make decisions. So Little Shell, the chief, had to really convince people. He had to be a leader in a way that involves people and doesn't just say, yeah, this is how it's going to happen. And the Métis were always part of that. Differences, you know, I don't know how much we really powwow even as Chippewa people traditionally, but I do know that the Métis didn't powwow the way that we tend to try and powwow today. I just had to answer a bunch of questions from a student in Anaconda whose name is Ruby Latreille, she's a sophomore now, related to powwows and, you know, traditional versus like contest dancing where there's money involved. And I don't know how traditional powwows are at all. And, you know, my argument is, let's not go after something that is a celebration, that brings everybody together. Of all the concerns that we fight about in Indian country, the last thing I'm worried about is whether we pay someone because they're a good dancer or not. I'm more concerned about all the Chinese-made bullshit in the vendor area, you know, that's for sale than I am about giving $50 to a dancer. But, you know, the Métis and the fiddle tradition is a huge part of that. And people like Jamie Foxx, you know, she's 32 years old, maybe, that younger generation, but not, you know, younger middle-aged, I guess I would say. And what she does to revive people's interest in that's a very Métis thing. You know, our Red River carts aren't around anymore. I thought about getting a bright cherry red car and getting my license plate to say like Red River on it, just to revive that tradition too, but I didn't. But historically, the Red River cart is very much an indicator of Métis culture. Talking about cattle ranching before the Texans ever realized there was anything north of the Red River of the South, we were already ranching with cattle up here, and that's a piece of history that people don't know. So a lot of it is historical, just reviving the knowledge of these things that the Métis are responsible for. But you know, if you go to Lewistown or if you come to Choteau when we do our celebrations and you see all these folks walking around with Métis sashes, that's pretty cool. And one thing that I've found in both of those events is the openness of everybody. Like, you walk through that door, it doesn't matter where you come from, you're Métis. And as long as you're celebrating with us, you're Métis. And if you stay with us, great, you're gonna be Métis. But if you wanna go on back to your life, that's fine too. But we don't have these barriers that I often run into in other Native communities from, you know, and they're all different. But I find that openness in the Métis community to be something very refreshing and fairly unique when it comes to tribal celebrations. I don't know if that answers your question, but yes.
How does it feel to be one of Creator's favorites as a Native man who can grow a beard?
Yeah, so.
That wasn't my real question. I just wanted to...
But I have amazingly had an answer to that, because I was in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, summer before last on the hardcover book tour. And there was I happened to be, that's where the Iowa Hawkeyes, and it was their homecoming. And there was a woman there, and I think she was a little tipsy. And at the end of the event, she said, you know, you don't even look like an Indian. And I said, well, what's an Indian supposed to look like? And she said, well, I thought you'd be more tan. And I said, well, I've been driving around in my car a lot. I've been out in the sun as much as I would like to be. And she, you know, was back and forth a couple more times. And I said, if you look at that book cover, and you look at that old tintype, is how that photo was taken, which is the second oldest form of photography in the history of photography. And if you take that bearded face, I'm really trying not to say bad things about myself here because I'm sick of that picture. And you put that amongst a picture of all those Métis patriots who died shoulder to shoulder with Louis Riel and all those other guys fighting the Canadians in 1885, that face fits in with every one of those people. And that, you know, to me is all I need to know. And that comes back to the idea of what people have about what Indians are supposed to look like. So the only reason I accepted that photo, because I sent it in as my author photo, and like 10 minutes later they said, we want to use this for the cover. And I was horrified. And then they sent me, Neil, this is why. And so I sat and I looked at that picture and I realized that, you know, I look like my ancestors. This is what the men of my family would have looked like going back generation to generation, just like the photos you showed me. And that's part of our part of Indian country. And I'm sick of the picture, but I don't regret having it on there. Did you have an actual serious question to follow?
What do you see your role in our tribe moving forward now that, I guess I consider you sort of our go-to historian? Nicholas Ruman, you know, was before I sort of realized that I was a little shell, and so I can't tap into that resource anymore. But what do you see as sort of, I consider you a knowledge keeper of our tribe. What do you see that role moving forward in the next 5-10 years?
I don't think that's ever going to change. And I think, you know, without getting too woo-woo about it, I think I was largely chosen for that role. You know, Nicholas reached so many people, both as Little Shell people, as fiddle players. His reach was vast. And when he passed on, there are those of us that he touched that it's our responsibility now to make sure the work he did continues. And, you know, I don't mean to embarrass you, Elisa, but, you know, at the powwow a couple years ago, you know, the tribe honored me because of Elisa as, you know, the voice of our tribe. And I take that very, very seriously. And I used to, I get involved, I get asked to participate in like a couple groups related to re-indigenizing Yellowstone National Park, which is a totally different discussion. But, you know, people that say you should run for tribal council. Well, if I did that, then I can't do these things. Because as soon as I sit down with the National Park Service, which is a federal agency, if I'm on the tribal council, now it's government to government interaction and the rules change. I can't stand up and just say whatever the freak I want to say like I can if I'm just a citizen. And, you know, the first couple meetings I would go to, I would kind of take a back seat and kind of let myself get pushed around a little bit by some of these other Native people. And then I realized, you know, I'm viewed as an elder in my community. I speak a little bit of our language. I know a lot about our culture and where we come from, at least as much as the majority of the other people in that room with me. And I stopped letting them push me around because I felt like you're pushing around the little shell and I'm not having that. And that totally changed the relationship and to the better. And that's, I feel, part of it. You had a question?
Yes. So when you talk about the beard and stuff, the French, you know, when they came in, the fur traders, I mean, you're from that side of your family,
Mhm.
the Latrays, the La.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So you're suggesting it's not just extra magnificence? No, it is true. It's more because I have like 5 chins, so I like to cover them up. Plus, it's a good ice cream catcher in the summer. Anybody else have questions or comments? Yes.
Can you share what led you to poetry?
I kind of backed into poetry. So, going back to like 2000 or 2008, 2007 or 2008, I had a different job and I hated it. And I would often find myself at the end of the day, like having wasted that whole day, the only version of that day I'm ever gonna have, in service to an employer I didn't respect, in industries that I would want to see fail, let alone help succeed. So, I mean, I've literally sat in conference rooms in Calgary trying to help people figure out better ways to frack the shit out of the environment. And I didn't want to be part of that. And I started, I don't know where I got the idea, because it certainly wasn't original to me, but I carry these notebooks, and I started writing one sentence a day, every day, that was some kind of a reflection on that day, whether it was a thought I had or something I overheard, and I'd write it down. And what I discovered early on is that I don't pay much attention to my life, because a lot of times I would realize that at the end of the day, I don't have anything that I remember that really moved me so much that I remember it well enough to write about. So I started paying closer attention to just the moment by moment episodes of my life, which is a very universal kind of, whether we're talking Zen Buddhism, we have that spiritual tradition too as an indigenous people. It's just not written down anywhere. Our stories didn't arise from people who weren't reflecting and contemplative. So that began my most important practice of my writing life, was beginning to write one sentence a day. And then later I read a book of short poems that were just little snapshots of these two poets' lives. And I realized that these were very much like what my sentences are. And so I went through those however many years of sentences and picked out my favorite ones and reconfigured them as short little poems. And that became my first book, One Sentence Journal. And people started introducing me as a poet, which kind of shocked. I had no plan or idea that I was going to be a poet. And I go, hey, there's the poet. And I'm like, what? Then I thought, well, that's kind of cool, because nobody cares about poets. Poets are like the punk rock of literature, because nobody writes a book of poetry and says, oh, I hope Spielberg makes a movie out of this, like novelists do. Anymore it seems like everybody's just writing a screenplay in hopes of getting a movie. Poets don't do that. We do it because we have to. And so that's how I became a poet, was just writing these things and then people recognizing. And the funny thing is that book came out August 14th, 2018, and it was August 14th, 2023, 5 years to the day of that book coming out, that the governor called me and said he was appointing me poet laureate. So it's one of those weird coincidences, of which there are many along the course of writing all this stuff. So yeah, it was just kind of an accident.
So Chris, through your journey of learning to become a Native person, did you also do the path of the teachings, the 7 grandfather teachings? Have you
That's what's tattooed on my forearm.
integrated that into your life as well?
I have, and I'm usually failing at 5 or 6 of them at any given moment, but that's why I tattooed that on my forearm, is to be reminded all the time that this is how I'm supposed to be living my life. So yes, and that was the direct result of, I don't know that I'd ever heard of it before until we decided as a tribe that the Elders Council said we are going to use the 7 grandfather teachings as our code for the Little Shell, and that's when I was first really introduced to it and went all in with it. And now I find it, like Leanne Simpson, the elder that she talked about, calls it the 7 grandmother teachings over on the east side of the Anishinaabe territory, which I think is kind of cool. And I've thought about kind of changing it when I talk about it, because it focuses the attention on grandmothers and women. I said, if my grandmother hadn't made it very clear to me that I was Chippewa, I wouldn't be here. And I credit the women of our community almost exclusively for preserving our culture so that we could have something left when we receive this federal recognition. Because they're the ones who are maintaining the kinship networks, maintaining the traditions that live in the kitchen and things like that. And without that, we wouldn't have anything to return to. So anything that we can do, and I think that is a change that intertribally is happening, is people are recognizing how much authority and agency colonialism has taken from the women in our communities, and we are returning to that. I know the Lakota are doing that. Many tribal communities are saying, yeah, we need to return to that before we're ever going to be what we need to be.
We have a elders group that gets together once a week of women,
Uh-huh.
and we do a teaching every week. And we talk about it and how it affects our life and what we need to do.
Yeah,
It's important to us.
yeah. That's a good question. Thank you. I'm glad you guys do that.
One of the first books that I recall reading about Métis was Strange Empire. And, I mean, here in Great Falls, we grew up, thinking about the Birdtail Mission and St. Peter's and so forth, but never did I hear the story of Louis Riel
Uh-huh.
and the important role that he played in trying to get property rights
Uh-huh.
for the Métis in Canada and the U.S.
Yeah.
also. But was there any books that predated that story?
Predated? Not that I know of.
I mean, was that kind of the first story about?
At least on this side of the medicine line, for sure. I'm pretty sure of that, because that was what, in the 40s when he wrote that?
Well, I think, yeah, maybe, yeah, late 40s, early 50s.
Uh-huh.
I mean, the book wasn't even published till after his death.
Right.
They, find the manuscript, and I can't remember. It's one of his friends that kind of got it all together and had it published in his name. But I mean, it's a wonderful story that.
Well, and a critical part of that book too is that, Nicholas Vrooman told me on multiple occasions that the reason he came out here in the first place was because his father, when he was a teenager, gave him a copy of Strange Empire. And Nicholas was so captivated by that story that it defined his whole life. Became a folklorist and came out here. First he's the first North Dakota folklorist, and he's working on the Turtle Mountain Reservation. And then he comes to Montana and becomes the second Montana state folklorist and starts working with the Little Shell. And if that book hadn't landed in his hands, where would we be?
Now, did Nicholas have any Métis
No.
ancestry or?
No, he was a Dutch white dude from upstate New York. And he said the whole idea of mixed culture really struck him when in I think it was one of his parents' like high school annuals or something like that, there was other Vroomans in there and they were black. And he realized that, our family is mixed also. So he came west with that idea of kind of contrary, where we try and put everybody in these pure boxes, and it hasn't been like that for 600 years, Yeah, so that book plays a role in just, where would we be without Nicholas's help?
I mean, from what I've read, there's the whole area around Lewistown. I mean, most of the people that settled in the area around Lewistown were Métis that
Yes.
came from Canada. So, but I mean, I know there is a celebration over there.
Every Labor Day.
But it's not very widely publicized, and is that? Can you tell us a little more about that event and what takes place there?
Well, what I think is hilarious is you have all of those signs around central Montana that says, "Save the Cowboys, Stop American Prairie," when the reality is the majority of the cowboys in central Montana that they're talking about were Métis. They weren't even white dudes at all in the first place. Yeah, that we have organizers for festivals like that who are in their 60s and 70s now and aren't really savvy with social media, which is how everybody looks for their, announcements for things like that. The people who know, if you go there's people down from Canada, there's people from all over the country. So, if you're interested, you can find out it's happening. And, we're not necessarily in the business of attracting everybody, you know, so it's you know, like when we unveiled the monument in the cemetery in Lewistown, I remember getting up in front of that audience and looking out on the cemetery, and it's just full of people. And there are people from Manitoba and Saskatchewan and Ontario, not to mention all of us from Montana and the Dakotas and everything, everybody there to celebrate the first people to die in that community and be buried and forgotten about, if not for the efforts of people like Elisa Herodes, who led the charge to make that monument happen. And what a revelation it was to see, you know, this is who we are. All of these people, how did they find out about it? I don't know. I'm lucky, I have a newsletter and it goes out to 20,000 people. So everywhere I go, I have people coming, you know, but it's a weird world when it comes to promoting stuff like that. Yes?
I think if you go Google Indian country in Montana, it will tell you everything that's going on in the state of Montana for native stuff and all tribes. A lot of times that's where you find it.
Indian country?
Mhm.
I'm great at learning stuff like 2 days after it happened. That's my information finding thing. It's like, well, maybe next year. Anybody else? Question? Yes?
Just quick, I don't know if somebody else was raising their hand or if it was me.
No, it's you. They could all raise their hand, at least, and if you so much as scratched your cheek, I'm like, yes?
This better be a good question then, but it isn't. But how many times have you heard from Little Shell citizens that you wrote their story?
Every time I do something, in all over the country. I was in Vancouver, Washington, 2 or 3 weeks ago, and there was a woman sitting about where you are in relation to where I am, and she said her mom was Little Shell, and she's Gardapi. And I'm like, well, I'm Gardapi too in my family tree, so we're cousins. And a little while later, this other woman came in a little late, and she raised her hand for a question, and I call on her. She started speaking back to me, kind of like how I introduced myself, only she's in like Michif Cree. And, you know, I'm picking the words out, and she's a Gardapi. And, you know, here we are, however many 900 miles or 600 miles away from, you know, here, and there's 3 cousins, certainly, to some degree or another, who just happen to be there. I mean, we are everywhere. And that's what I wanted, is people to say that. And it's also people who aren't necessarily Little Shell. You know, I wanted to reach anybody who's had to live kind of in the closet from who they really are and how hard that is, and which so many of us and our parents and grandparents have had to do, and how difficult that is. And, you know, what my biggest concern now is I think about, you know, my parents are of the generation that are our oldest elders, you know, in our 80s and 90s. And, you know, those folks aren't going to be around here forever. We hope forever. But the reality is that we are going to start losing those vast libraries of knowledge. And then people like Elisa and I have to step up, because then we become the next generation of elders. And I don't feel like I know shit. I am at best a bookmobile of knowledge, you know? And I wonder, you know, what is my role then? And I think all that knowledge is out there because the original instructions where they came from in the land in the first place is going to return to us the more we embrace who we are through the language and sitting together and sharing our stories. But I think our responsibility is to just be out and loud about who we are and where we came from in ways that our elders could not be. And I think that is part of this long game reconnection process that we have to engage in for the future of our people. And coming to that realization has made me feel a little more peaceful about it, because I'm not going to be fluent in the language, no matter how hard I try, before I die. And there are plenty of ceremonies that are not going to come back in my lifetime, but that doesn't mean that they won't maybe in my son's lifetime or the next generation's lifetime. All of these things are a long game. And even 3 generations of people isn't that long when it comes to the time that we have been here on this place. Anybody else? I guess here comes the hook. Well, I'm really grateful that you guys came out. You know, I hope this was something you hoped for. I show up and I really never have a plan, but I am very grateful that you're here. Yes?
What's your next book going to be after becoming Little Shell?
You know, I'm about with that book where I was when I first sat down with that editor, you know, in 2019 or 2018. So I have a bunch of ideas bouncing around, but you know, the worst thing is if I was to say, well, I think it's gonna be this, this, and this, and someone over here says, well, that's dumb. I'd be struck with like imposter syndrome, and I may never write another book. I can say that there's gonna be another book of poetry coming out in July. Just a small press, same people who published my second book, Descended from a Travel-Worn Satchel. I don't want to go, they're a small press, and these are poems that you know, I've written years ago. Like the whole time I was poet laureate, I realized I only wrote 4 poems. And that's because I was the poet laureate of emails for 2 years. And so I want all those ones that I wrote up to the point that I was appointed poet laureate, I want to just get those out. And so I can move on to something else. And that's what's going to come out in July, in time for Indigipalooza in Missoula, which is July 31st and August 1st, which is a big Native celebration. And we haven't announced it formally yet, but Robin Wall Kimmerer is our headliner.
Stop it.
Yeah. And there's this
Come on
punk.
together here.
Yeah, there's this punk band called the Dead Pioneers who are going to come and play, and my band's going to open for them. And Wab Shib Rice, who is a Anishinaabe Canadian writer who wrote a couple wonderful kind of dystopian novels. One's Moon of the Crusted Snow, and then the other one is Moon of the Falling Leaves. And he's great. Who else? Rebecca Nagel wrote By the Fire We Carry, which is a story of the Cherokee. She and I were on a panel together at the Mississippi Book Festival, of all places, last summer. So yeah, the lineup is building. It's going to be awesome.
What are those dates again?
July 31st, August 1st.
Let's go, Sarah.
Yeah, let's do it. Road trip.
Yeah.
Okay, sweet.
Robin's success with Braiding Sweetgrass is the coattails that my book is writing on. Because that book has been so hugely successful because we share a publisher and we share a speaking agent. Like whatever Robin's doing, that's what I want to do. I just haven't sold the 2 million copies that she has. But yeah, so that is kind of how it works with a publisher like Milkweed. They're a nonprofit, so it's not like these books have to sell a ton for them to keep publishing potentially risky books like mine. And you know, she's just set a course for all of us, and I'm really grateful.
She was my professor in college.
Was she? Cool. Yeah, well, she's coming.
Do you happen to know, last year the Little Shell had, I don't know, it was kind of like a Christmas bazaar or something where, at the community center, where people, I guess mostly tribal members, but other people from other tribes also displayed things that they had made or cooked or whatever, and then they had a little raffle there. I haven't seen anything posted on that yet. Do you happen to know whether they're doing that again this year?
Like around Christmas time?
Yes.
Isn't that like half a year away still?
I won the raffle of a little rocking horse, and my new little, I gave it to my new little great grandson who was not even 1 yet, and I told his parents, I said, I'm not sure if he's ready for this or not. Anyway, he gets on that thing at Christmas and he's rocking away.
Yeah, I don't know. Like I said, I'm generally out of the loop until it's too late on stuff like that.
Does anybody here know if they're having that this year?
I'll get back to you later.
Yeah, if anybody would know, it's Elisa, but you know, we're not going to put her on the spot for
I
that.
got on powwow committee more, and it was a powwow fundraiser.
That was last year?
Yeah. But
Are they doing it again?
no, not that I know of.
Bummer.
I know.
We agree.
There is going to be the Saturday after Christmas, there's going to be an indigenous art show or craft show or something in Missoula at the fairgrounds in Missoula.
Mhm.
I
They
think
do
it's
that every
like
year.
9 to 3 or something like
Mhm.
that I read about, so.
Yeah. Yeah, there's stuff going on this weekend, I think, somewhere. I mean, there's stuff all the time. There's something going on in Helena, I think, this weekend. I don't know.
Well, this weekend is the CMR Youth Powwow, Saturday, I think it is.
9 a.m.
The Youth Powwow, the
CMR?
CMR gym.
They have vendors at that, yeah.
Well, again, miigwech, thank you for everybody for coming out. I'll sign books if you have them. Or
Well, thank you again, everybody, for coming out this evening. It's always a pleasure to have you and to have amazing conversation as a community. We do have Cassiopeia, like I said, over here selling books, so please continue to purchase more if you would like. As Chris said, he would be willing to sign them as well. Eat a couple more cookies, because I can't do it alone. And I also need to thank our 2 sponsors for this evening. So we have the Great Falls Public Library Foundation, and then we also have the Montana Arts Council, and they're literally paying me to say this. So additional support from coal tax placed into Montana's Cultural and Aesthetic Projects Trust Fund helped fund this program. So thank you to the Montana Arts Council. Thank you all so much. There is always things going on here at the library, so just keep posted on our Facebook mainly, or sign up for our email list over there. We look forward to seeing you again next time. Have a good one.